Hello, everybody, and thank you very much for being with us here for tonight's virtual lecture series. I have the extreme pleasure of getting introduced our student lecturer this evening, Miss Amber Paquette. Today, she's going to be doing a presentation on the economic and maritime security, strategic implications of an ignored China. So, Amber, thank you so very much for being here tonight. And for those of you that are watching, we will have about a 10-15 minute session at the end for some Q&A time. And with that, Amber, the floor is yours. Thanks once again for being here.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Brett, for introducing me. And yes, my name is Amber Paquette, and I'm currently a master's student at Nova studying national security affairs and international relations. And I'll be graduating this May. I also have a bachelor's from Nova in legal studies with minors in history and business. And I'm a member of the President 64 at Nova, and I'm doing a lot of volunteer work with that. But thank you all for joining the lecture this evening, and I will be getting into my presentation on some economic and maritime security trends and the strategic implications of an ignored China. Uh, will the presentation be presented?
Do you want me to share the screen, Amber, or would you like to?
Oh yeah, I can share the screen. That would be perfect.
Sounds good.
Okay, put my phone on, my computer on silent. Thank you. And we're gonna, oops. I don't know why this won't do full screen.
I think it's at the bottom. There's a little button that says like slide projection at the bottom. It's like a little looks like a projector screen.
Hmm.
Yes.
Oh, that's not it.
No, at the yeah, that button to the left of the minus symbol.
Awesome, thank you.
No problem.
Okay, and I already briefly introduced myself, but I am a student within um, the Department of Humanities and Politics, studying national security and international relations. So I have a little table of contents. We're going to go through just my introduction, my argument, and the monopoly on China's shipbuilding and some data information and my analysis. So, so just some background information. Currently, thinking about this is going to be thinking about China and its recent actions. And just some background to set us up is that although China's government structure is organized with the one-party system and the Chinese Communist Party holds power, uh, the nation does participate in the global capitalist economy, and it has since the 1970s and especially after 2001, where China ascended to the World Trade Organization. And the World Trade Organization is a global international organization that helps set trade parameters for how countries interact with one another and deal. And there's certain agreements that govern those deals. So that allowed China's economy to expand and allow for China to increase its exports, exporting goods and manufactured goods to nations across the world. And that really opened up China to be doing business with other nations. And um, during this time in the 1980s and 90s, a lot of US manufacturing was outsourced to China. And given that over time, that had some domestic US consequences as well as allowed for China to and its economy to begin manufacturing products, and they actually got to keep the technology from the outsourcing of the manufacturing. And later that technology was used so that allowing them to build their um own technology advancements and just apply that. So that kind of just gives an example of how when countries outsource their labor, the technological innovations that come along with it are transferred to the other nations. Um, but this outsourcing of labor was critical for global production and manufacturing, and it had a trickle-down effect that we can see in this brief numbers that I've included in the bottom. So currently, the trade deficit, which is there's either a surplus or a deficit. So with China and the US, China's surplus of trade is currently at 279 billion US dollars versus when in 1985, China's surplus of trade with the United States was just 6 billion. So I think that just goes to show in about 47 years, the magnitude of growth that China's experienced and trade and it China now makes up the world's global trade. The so they're kind of dominating this force, but China experienced rapid growth in the 21st century, especially, and it currently leads export percentage across the world according to the United Nations Trade and Development organization. So this trade surplus just kind of speaks to how much China's economy has grown since the 80s and since its onset of exports. That was just some background information so we're all on the same page. But in considering this, I will be discussing how the world systems theory interplays with the recent phenomenon and growth of China and their monopoly on the shipbuilding sector. This framework for analysis will be helpful when considering China's growth in the global economy, and pretty much I'll be using this as a vehicle, China's shipbuilding monopoly, as a vehicle to show how China elevated in the world system and now can be characterized as a core nation. So I'll just kind of break down this theory really quick. Author Wallerstein's theory helps to communicate global economic development over time, as well as we can help utilize this to understand the emergence of China's strategic position in the world that I'm going to get into a little bit later. But basically, world systems theory will be, oops, where did my slide? Basically, basically, world systems theory can be characterized as having three distinct classifications of a nation. So there's the core nation, which is at the center and utilizes other designations such as the periphery and semi-periphery to help foster its global capitalism and relies upon these nations in order to maintain their status in the global structure. So the some examples previously, China was considered a semi-periphery nation, which we can see that by exporting goods to the United States and many other countries and manufacturing those goods, nations, it became, nations became, um, their success coincided with having exported goods. So these semi-periphery and periphery nations support the core nations and kind of reinforce their position or power in the world. So it's a structure of classifications of nations, and it's important to consider. And I'll just be thinking about um how China's position as a previous semi-periphery and how they got to being now in line with the US, some say, as a core nation. So in order to do that, like the vehicle will be the shipbuilding, and monopoly on the shipbuilding and supply chains. That's kind of like the vehicle that allowed China to get to coronation status. So I'm just going to give some information about this shipbuilding monopoly. So in recent years, in 2024, 84% of new ships were in the world were built by China. This was one source reporting that I'm citing. It's a researcher. And additionally, another source talks about 60% of new shipbuilding orders in the past year since 2023, world's largest ship owner was China, and there's been a 61% increase in global shipbuilding orders from 2020 to 2024, on behalf of China, and South Korea is just in second with a 28% increase. So this just kind of shows the global dominance of China on the shipbuilding industry, and in 2024 a 61% increase. They do hold 60% of new orders, and they are the world's largest ship owner. And within China's recent developments, many of their civilian ships are also designed to be dual use ships so they can be leveraged militarily. And in the last decade, China has been actively working on a new initiative called the Belt and Road Initiative, which has the hopes of bringing new markets as well as infrastructure programs to many nations in Latin America as well as within Africa, and they have a plan to accomplish this. And there's a new plan that also includes a maritime Silk Road. So China's initiatives in global policy seek to connect the world and connect the world through railways and shipping routes and bring ultimately bring their goods to new markets and expand themselves globally. So a lot of these ports within the Belt and Road Initiative that have been constructed also have this dual use capability. Although they're commercial shipping ports, they can be militarized by China, and that's just an important like side note. And China is the world's largest exporter for seaborne trade. So that just goes to show their capacity, and the numbers all communicate that they are definitely dominating shipbuilding, ship like trade routes and exportation, and seek to continue this with their plans for the Belt and Road Initiative and Maritime Silk Road. So that's why I've characterized this phenomenon in China's actions as having a monopoly on global shipping and global supply chains, as well as tapping into global strategic sectors within their exports and technology. And some characterize these as foundational technologies, including like semiconductors, artificial intelligence, and using innovation to apply those to robotics, new energy vehicles, and telecommunications. So this kind of just communicates how these technologies and China's monopoly on the shipbuilding industry has translated to rapid growth, innovation, and they have become a key actor on the world stage. Um, oh, here was my slide about the core and periphery countries. But yeah, this kind of just briefly goes over that relationship between core nations, periphery nations, and semi-periphery, which I would characterize the United States as a core nation and China as now a core nation, but previously was a semi-periphery and was ultimately the theory contends that peripheries are exploited through unfavorable trade and are ultimately a byproduct of the world system and their exploitation to core countries in order to produce and sustain core countries and the wealth accumulated in the global system. So basically, China's monopoly on the commercial shipbuilding industry and global export surplus, coupled with its vast territorial expansive policies in the region, possess global and economic strategic security implications. And I wanted to just make a brief distinction. Like, there's two aspects to this argument. One is its commercial capabilities and business activities, but due to the overlap in China's economy between private and government um, goods and operations due to the nature of the economy, there is some overlap here between state and economics. And then secondly, China's military expansive policies. I'll get into that a little bit, but ultimately China is actively becoming expansive and threatening freedom of navigation within the region. And that in and of itself, to threaten freedom of navigation, constitutes a threat to maritime security. But um, China has had a history of escalating tensions within the South China Sea and routinely targeting the Philippines and their fishing vessels, as well as recent naval simulations and naval demonstrations in the South China Sea in an attempt to instill fear against Taiwan and kind of um, they had a simulation of a naval blockade around Taiwan. So these two aspects, the commercial aspect as well as the strategic military actions coupled together, help to communicate my main argument. So kind of why is this relevant? Whatever China's actions are and how it behaves will dictate and interfere and disrupt global business, global supply chains, the free flow of goods, and will have impacts on global trade and business, as well as could, as well as will affect international relations and how nations will interact with one another for not only economic purposes, but as well as militarily. So I just thought maybe some questions about why this is happening, a brief background about U.S. actions. After post-World War II and entering the Cold War, the U.S. Navy um, during World War II, the U.S. Navy was dominating shipbuilding globally, and there was a need for there was a growing need for ships to for the war effort and for technological innovation, etc. But over time, within the U.S., the shipbuilding had shifted to the private sector, and the U.S. Navy was no longer designing and working on technology within the military at the rapid rate that it once was during World War II and entering the Cold War. And then this coupled with the 1980s outsourcing of labor globally, this can kind of communicate why China has now taken over dominating global shipbuilding and has trade surpluses with virtually almost all nations. So this kind of puts it in the context of the US perspective. So some strategic security implications of an unchecked China or continuing the disparity between China's shipbuilding monopoly and shipbuilding and supply chains comparatively to the United States and security implications due to its rise as a core nation from a periphery. This widening gap illustrates China's growing industrial base and the US's, some may characterize declining industrial base, but virtually pretty much the US movement away from manufacturing and towards um, privatization. So shipbuilding in and of itself sits at the corner of this imbalance, and um, Beijing, China has definitely outpaced the US in its ability to create vessels efficiently, um, without super high costs, and be able to utilize them to benefit their economy through global trade and exports. And their just domination on supply chains. Within the Indo-Pacific, deterrence now depends on the number of ships and the ability or capability of quick repairs and technology. And since the US hasn't been constructing ships nearly to the level at um, China, it's a wide gap. I think the US was like 0.01% ships constructed in the last year. Due to this disparity, it's just interesting from the US perspective for like national security and defense purposes. And although it was beneficial to the US economy to outsource labor and elevate itself in the world system into the next level of development, China is now set itself up to be pretty much self-sufficient on the world stage and be able to dominate and get goods and services, control the supply chains. They're working on strategic technologies, all these aspects. Some people argue that the US is falling behind, but this just goes to communicate that China, due to their activities, and shipbuilding could be one of the main proponents of this, they have now risen to core status in the global system. And ultimately, global maritime security will be impacted with if China continues its business activities as well as its um, territorial expansion within its region, because threatening the freedom of navigation in global waters, coupled with its capacity and domination of um, trade routes and shipbuilding, this could propose strategic security implications. So the specifically the domination of global supply chains and transport of strategic sectors that they control, um, this could this could leave nations that aren't allied with China to be isolated on the world stage and get caught off from rare earth minerals or certain technologies that are constructed in the region where this could put the US at a disadvantage technologically and in terms of strategic and economic implications. So I just thought that was important to point out. Um, and this influence on those strategic sectors and controlling of the supply chains for those strategic sectors, China could cut off other nations, um, especially with rare earth minerals that are essential for certain technologies, and it becoming increasingly more in demand. This could propose security and strategic implications for um, all nations if China were to decide to cut certain nations off from from access to those minerals. So other nations are going to have to find ways to make up for that. But given the new innovations and end-to-end supply chain that China is working on and in attempts to control rare earth mineral supplies, there has been heightening tensions between China and Taiwan, and global maritime security crises. We think about what's going on with the current conflict and the recent crisis in the Strait of Hormuz, and that's threatening oil from readily being accessed. And I thought this was an interesting thing to include. So China imports approximately like 37% of its oil within the Strait of Hormuz, which currently at this time it is not safe for vessels to transport within the Strait of Hormuz, given the conflict between Iran and Israel and the United States and the bombings that are going on. Vessels it's are unable to pass through there safely. But due to China's breadth of industrial manufacturing and volume of its oil that it imports, mostly through Russia and India and other mechanisms, and the volume that it needs to manufacture on the level that it does, China's virtually like insulated and unaffected from the recent uh, disruptions in the Strait of Hormuz because they have a stockpile and they're not virtually dependent on many nations. Yes, this stockpile eventually, if the conflict continues for an extended period of time, yeah, it could hit China a little bit, but they're insulated almost within their nation from certain global crises that are occurring, and that just makes that nation more resilient and less vulnerable to what's going on in the world. And I think that goes to show China's resiliency in supply chain as well as economic manufacturing and their capabilities, how they've kind of protected themselves in such a way. So when we think about those things coupled together, it's interesting um to see China's power, and it's evident of China's rise to a core nation status under the world systems theory. Because even the US, the core nation is currently struggling with this status. And one little caveat to note is under the core status, most of the time some ways to recognize a nation as a core status is within how they're designated in major global organizations across the world stage. And although that is an aspect that China's not involved in, besides the United Nations and major trade organizations, due to its nature as not a liberal international nation, it's not really involved as deeply into liberal institutions. But I would say that that's the only pushback on China rising as a core nation because all other evidence concludes that as a vehicle of their rise in their economy and shipbuilding and resiliency, and from the example provided about the current state of affairs, China is a core nation. And to wrap up a little bit, I wanted to just discuss a little bit more of the global economic implications of an unchecked China. So this later down the line could potentially have adverse effects for the US economy and global capitalism, as China is working on their new initiatives within the Belt and Road Initiative and Maritime Silk Road to um, with to support their soft power in a sense, but also to support their business and global um, supply chains. And if they have new markets that are open to them through these maritime sea trade routes, as well as the infrastructure that they're building in other nations to connect roads and connect populations and people with one another, this will give them new markets, and they don't need to export necessarily in, they don't need to be an export economy anymore. They will have new markets to tap into, yes, but it it just shows how their economy is an integral part of the global economy, and the economic benefits of China developing infrastructure and trade routes and ports in nations that don't have strong infrastructure. Um, this kind of shows that soft power that will be associated, and the fact that these nations, particularly within Latin America and um, Africa, are kind of being groomed or set up to become semi peripheries for China itself. An example of this, I would say, is the mines that are being the mines that have been in operation within the Congo and other nations within the surrounding that area in Africa, and China has been actively there and working on construction and working on the mines and setting them up so that they can receive rare earth minerals from these new periphery and semi-periphery nations. So wanna I just wanted to use that example to show how China really is emerging as a core stat nation in the global structure, and how they're setting themselves up to have new peripheries. Um, and all of that is possible and capable to occur because of the way that China's monopoly on the shipbuilding industry and monopoly on supply chains has set them up and been served as a vehicle to allow them to do so over time, as well as through China's rapid economic growth. And that's just set them up in order to do that effectively. And where does that leave the US? That's a question I would propose. Where does that leave the US in 10, 15, 20 years with regards to global economics and China's recent BRICS initiative, which is an economic initiative with Brazil, Russia, Iran, China, and South Africa to to make its own institution where for global economics, where it's insulated and have a forum to eventually seek to n not make the dollar the dominant currency on the global stage. But in the meantime, this organization is being leveraged and set up as a framework in order to set China and its economic allies up to ultimately not be reliant on US currency and have their own global currency. So just given that, and coupled with the Belt and Road Initiative and the building up of infrastructure and the vehicle in which China has employed in order to do so, China is emerging as a core nation, and it's going to have economic implications across the globe. Um, given given strategic implications, that's a question of our nation's been too reliant on outsourcing certain manufacturing, and I think we can see evidence of that with the trend U.S. presidential administration seeking to build back its manufacturing and bring back manufacturing jobs and industrial base within the United States, whether that's to counter China or it's just to make the U.S. more secure. But those tactics are being leveraged and employed. There's recent talks of uh, implementing a new oil refinery within California, and it's strategic response on the U.S. and to really think about um, how the disparity among shipbuilding within the United States versus within China. And I did have some brief vessel information to compare the U.S. Navy fleet in with 290 ships currently versus China's Navy having 331. But the interesting thing that I mentioned earlier was the dual use of civilian fleets, which would bring that number up to 5,500. And although the United States weapons are vastly more sophisticated than China, and I'm not alluding to a physical conflict or war or threat on the ground with China with the numbers, but it's just helping to communicate the disparity between vessel construction and production in the US versus China's, and signaling why there has been a recent trend and recent effort to restore like US industrial capacity and focus on shipbuilding and maritime that shipbuilding sector and develop these ships so that because no other nations are putting out numbers like China is with regards to shipbuilding. So this is just important to think about and just to consider recent actions and if whether or not the recent actions would be seen on a certain lens of um, building up power, but I think ultimately it is a strategic action. Overall, I would say that um, this is why I'm discussing this issue is that um, if attention was not to be drawn to China's recent monopoly on shipbuilding and control of supply chains and control of strategic sectors of technology and minerals at the pace in which they are going, um, many nations could find themselves, especially within the West, isolated and cut off from access to these strategic resources as well as access to basic goods in which many nations ex import and rely upon for everyday activities as well as the security of the people. So I'm just drawing attention to if this were not to be um, emphasized and if this were to go unchecked at the pace in which China is going now, there could be some stark economic and strategic implications for not only um, nations or the United States, but on a global scale. As so as well as to highlight China's rise into a core status versus periphery. So thank you guys for listening to my presentation, and that about wraps it up. And I've included my sources that I've consulted on the last two pages. Thank you.
Awesome. Amber, thank you very much. I really appreciate the presentation. If it is always fascinating to, hear our students' perspectives on everything, particularly in certain areas of more of a global impact. So I really do appreciate you taking the time to speak with us. If there are any questions, please feel free to put them in the chat. I did have one, obviously, as I was listening. I said I always find these topics really intriguing. So my question is, with the U.S. having so many major ports and companies, where we're in Fort Lauderdale, we do have our own major port kind of right in our city area. Why do you think potentially we haven't seen a really big, increase to meet this change in China? Like, why hasn't the US kind of vamped up really quickly to kind of either counter it or, build our own version of it?
Yeah, thank you so much for your question. I think that China's activities over time have been very almost under the radar and been very supportive to um, global economic efforts. And they didn't all happen at once. Like they've been building up their ships and their technology and their exports for a very long time incrementally. And it's like when does it become like, oh no, like it's a crisis? Like I think certain government officials and scholars and military personnel have been monitoring this and thinking about the what China's doing kind of behind the scenes and strategically, but I don't think it's become like a public outrage or of concern to where we want to cause a oh no, this is going on and what are we gonna do? Like that kind of happened with the TikTok threat to national security because it served certain interest to do so, but I would say that um, it's been very incremental and it hasn't been to a point where it's it's in the popular media because there seems to be other more important or pressing things that are going to be discussed and that on the short term will benefit maybe the US or other nations. But I think this is a question that the scholars that are thinking about it and asking are thinking about the long-term global implications that could come from this, and they can kind of see the chain of events of if we don't have certain technologies or certain critical minerals and resources, how are we going to go on or move away from that? So I think it's not like an overnight thing, and it's kind of been happening behind the scenes. It's been like a chess game. So but that is a really great question, and I do feel like sometimes we do need to talk about this topic more because a lot of people maybe don't even know about this and don't see these actions, and I am very passionate about this topic. But yeah, thank you for your question.
Absolutely. I do have another question in the chat, so I'll read it to you. So first of all, great job. Um, with the US-led trade wars and real wars leading to the slowdown of trade, does this mean that communists and the Chinese are more reliable custodians of global capitalism?
Let me think about that for a second.
Very loaded question.
Um, given that answer, I would say there's a couple important things to think about. So, in essence, China is operating global capitalism on a more effective level and more efficiently. Oh no, is my computer gonna die? China is operating and participating in global capitalism in a much more effective and efficient manner than um, the US, given the global trade war, because um, they're not protecting their industries with tariffs and other measures at the level that the United States is. And they're still participating in global capitalism with um, their trade is still going on. They're not protecting their industries, and they're dominant in the global economy. So I would say, given given that and given the trade wars, and the slowdown of trade which is happening, they are being more effective in participating in global capitalism, although their nature isn't their nature is still participating in global capitalism. But with the US trade wars, we do see a slowing down of um, oil imports and exports and interference within the system, and through that, um, through that, through the through that, the trade is being slowed down. We see it more challenging to get oil, easily accessed, the rise in oil prices. So I would say yes. I would say yes to that question. They are operating in the heart of capitalism, which is so ironic, and many might not see that, but they are operating that more than employing protectionist tariffs and interfering with global capitalism, and that in the way that the US is doing with the targeting interference and tariffs. So that was my long-winded answer.
Thank you very much for that answer and for that question. Thank you, viewer. Kind of a follow-up to that question. Why do you believe China um, is able to still have their industries without being protected the way the US has to or has
Um,
chosen to?
yeah, they don't feel the need to um employ like protectionism and certain t tariffs and different tactics because essentially their industries are not in danger. They have a surplus of goods and services to um, export globally, and their industries are not in danger. And the US is doing it to protect its industries because I think they're analyzing it that their industries are under pressure and don't have the ability to sustain themselves. So in order to do that, they have to implement certain measures to protect their industry because we do not have an industrial base, and China's being very resilient and accomplishing what they're doing. So yeah.
Awesome. Thank you, Amber.
Thank you.
Any other questions? I want to make sure I'm cognizant of your time, Amber. I know how busy you are with all your studies and your finals and everything coming up soon. So I want to make sure I don't take up too much of your time this evening.
No, you're good. I was happy to do this. I was gonna say a little like, no, I just interned in maritime and security and intelligence for a company, and they had me focusing on the region of the South China Sea and looking at what's going on between Taiwan and the Philippines, and coupled with my degree wrapping up and everything that I've learned, this has just become like a focus. And Dr. Edwards help like as a professor, he's been awesome to help me like really like dig into these issues and why they're happening, and get to the root of them and investigate and piece the things together. So I've become very passionate about getting into this topic when I just had my internship. So that just wanted to add a cool note.
Awesome. Well, then I guess that kind of leads into my last question here. What's next? You're about to be graduating. You said you had your internship. What is your plan for after graduation?
Yeah, so ra pretty soon I'll be finished up with my degree, and I'll definitely be applying for some positions. I'm thinking about going into like maritime security sector, whether it's intelligence or questions of like I would love to work in like an international law, international relations sense. I private company would be cool. And then I'm also thinking about like maybe the US Coast Guard or Navy for officer candidate school. Like that's just something I've been in the back of my mind for a very long time. But I'm just exploring my options, and I hope to work in and contribute to drawing attention to this sector and giving intelligence for question that's my cat scratching. Um giving questions of security and kind of just educating and drawing attention to issues that are oftentimes overlooked or are made as, like clickbait, but they don't really talk about what's really going on. So, questions of like global compliance on security issues, and I'll be applying for jobs. I'm in South Florida still at the moment, so we'll see. Maybe a job will take me, and I'll move for the job. So, yeah, I'm just
Awesome.
thinking about all my options.
Absolutely. Well, I have no doubt that you'll have many options available to you. So Amber, thank you so much for being with us, excuse me, this evening, and for being able to speak with our guests tonight. So for those of you that have watched tonight, thank you very much, and those watching later on our YouTube channels and any of our social media, thank you so much. And if you have any questions, feel free to reach out at any time. I'm sure Amber wouldn't mind answering a few email questions if they do come in. And for any of you students out there, we do have your virtual open house going to be coming up in just a few weeks, so keep an eye out in your emails for that. So, Amber, thank you so much. I hope you have a great rest of your week, and I look forward to talking to you again soon. Thank you so much, Amber. Have a good night.
Thank you so much for having me. Have a good night.
Bye
Bye-bye.
bye.